Getting the most XP out of any other class in the game hands down, Bishop is a really fun supportive explorer mage with plenty of skill options for both situations in bosses and doing pretty good damage to everything in your path. They used to be the baseline for what all other classes were based on for the DPM charts, but since their rework in Destiny, they've been pretty strong in both solo and party play. And they're also arguably the best grinding class with the heavy amounts of innate XP they get over any other class in the game. I'm going to skip going over their attacks that get replaced shortly after advancing to the next job rank, these in specific, and start from first job. Here, the passives they get give them a ton of mana per level, as well as attack speed, and a slight crit rate increase if you use a wand, some defense, and a toggle that you'll be wanting on all the time, every single time you log in, Magic Guard. When you take damage, most of that damage is instead taken out of your mana. At the time of recording this, 85% of said damage. Teleport is pretty much the definitive mage mobility skill in MapleStory. Slight delay of roughly about half a second in between teleports, but it blinks you from one spot to another, depending on what direction you hold. It can even be used in the air if there's a platform close enough by, either above, below, or horizontally. Mana Wave is an up jump that works well with teleport, letting you get good vertical distance and then snapping to a platform either just out of reach or one you overshot. If you hold Mana Wave's button after jumping, you float and slowly glide down for 5 seconds. Useful in later bosses to avoid things like Lotus's Electricity or Lucid's Dragon. Second job gives them a bunch more passives. Pretty much almost entirely passives actually. One being Blessed Ensemble, which is one of your first party boosted skills. It increases your final damage by 1% for each party member you've buffed with whatever skills you use to buff them, as well as increases XP by 20% for every other bishop in the party. Though since party training isn't all that great nowadays, that part's kinda useless. What buffs can you even use on party members at this level though? Bless is one. It's your first actual buff that gives everyone, including yourself, 15 attack and magic attack, as well as a pretty decent chunk of defense. Lastly, Heal restores health. Works on you and everyone in the party, reducing the cooldown per party member you heal. Also does damage on undead enemies, like zombies. 4-second cooldown. Third job, you get a couple more passives that give you a bunch of crit rate, as well as a couple new toggles. Teleport Mastery passively gives you some knockback resistance, and when toggled on, it does damage to enemies as well as has a chance to stun them. This toggle does increase the mana cost per teleport though. Teleport Boost is another toggle that doesn't eat into your teleport's mana costs, besides the initial 20 mana spent casting it on, and it simply increases the range of your teleport. Holy Magic Shell heals a little bit, and gives you and all your nearby party members a little bubble shield that blocks attacks and reduces damage. 90-second cooldown, and after being used, even if you somehow get your cooldown reduction lower than 80 seconds for this skill, it won't matter since the game forces you to wait minimum 80 seconds before casting it again. Holy Symbol is the definitive bishop skill. 50% bonus XP for yourself and kind of everyone in the party. See, if they walk away from you, after a certain distance or if they go to another map, their XP from this skill is halved. This skill is mostly useful just for yourself, as that's a flat extra free 50% XP forever. This gets a nice bonus once we get into hypers, more on that in a bit. Dispel is a neat little skill that simply removes debuffs cast on you by either various monsters, usually elite monsters nowadays, or bosses. 8-second cooldown. Mystic Door doesn't have any use in bosses, but when used in any other maps around the game, it sets up a gateway right back into the nearest town. This skill is essentially a free return to town scroll, but better, because you can go back through it to get back to whichever map you were on. Party members can use it too. Divine Protection gives passive status resistance and blocks debuffs up to 5 times. After it exhausts all these, the skill has an 80-second cooldown. It's pretty much a passive dispel just for yourself. Last skill at third is Holy Fountain. Once it's placed down, it heals anyone that goes up to it and clicks the up arrow key. It can be used a total of 20 times, and it's special in the fact that undead party members can heal from it too. 60-second uptime, 60-second cooldown. Fourth job gives a few more damage-centric passives, including this one that increases your buff duration by 50% for almost everything, the typical Maple Warrior and Hero's Will, and an upgrade to a Blessed Ensemble called Blessed Harmony. It now increases the final damage from 1% to 4% for yourself, and 2% final damage for each buffed party member. You also get an upgrade to Bless, which now becomes Advanced Blessing, and gives more stats, defense, health and mana, and less mana consumption. Resurrection revives a party member, and once revived, it increases their damage by 5% for 30 seconds, increasing based on your total int. It goes up 1% every 2500 int, up to 25% at 62.5k int. It's extremely worth noting this skill eats a life up in bosses, so typically when they die, unless they explicitly ask for your revive, it's better to just not revive them at all and instead let them revive themselves. 5-minute cooldown. Bahamut is a summoned dragon that does damage when you attack. If Bahamut attacks enemies, they're marked with a 60-second debuff that increases your final damage with a holy attack on said enemy by 25%, up to 1 hit per mark. Genesis is a little less than screen-wide attack, dealing a bunch of damage and increased critical rate, 30-second cooldown. Infinity is a very fun buff, 3-minute cooldown, but once you cast it, for however long its duration is, which gets increased with buff duration mind you, it constantly heals your mana and health a bit. It also initially increases your final damage by 70% and goes up by 3% periodically, up to 115%. Major burst buff. Big Bang is your main mobbing skill, and you'll be using this for grinding constantly. No cooldown, it can be used in the air, does more damage to normal enemies, and has a pretty nice hitbox. Angel Ray shoots a big beam of holy light forward, targeting whichever enemy has the highest health. It also heals party members, even ones with the undead debuff on them. It also applies a debuff to whatever it hits, which increases final damage of party members by 2% for 20 seconds, stacking up to 5 times for a total of 10% extra final damage for your whole party. And last but not least, Holy Water is coupled with Angel Ray. When you hit enemies, it gives you stacks of Holy Water, up to 5. When you use this skill, it consumes all stacks and summons chalices on the ground. These chalices can be picked up by party members using, much like Holy Fountain, the up arrow key to heal themselves. They last 5 seconds, heal for 5% total HP, and increase in duration and health restored, depending on how much int you have. This has no limit and can go up indefinitely. For hypers, Bishop starts off with Heaven's Door, which is an extra life for all party members. This doesn't count towards the boss's overall life count either. This is just a free life, permanently. There's a 10-minute cooldown in between revives once received, so that's potentially 2 to 3 extra lives per boss if you run out the full 30-minute timer on most bosses. Oh, it also does a ton of damage to all enemies on screen and has a 60-second cooldown. Epic Adventure is the same as any other class, 2-minute cooldown, 10% extra damage for you and any other explorers in the party, 60-second duration, meaning 1 minute uptime, 1 minute downtime. To your party, you can be their angel, but once you get Righteously Indignant, it also lets you be their devil. It swaps most of your old skills to now instead be focused entirely on damage with the click of a toggle. What does it change? Well, Heal now becomes Angelic Wrath, which now does damage to all enemies and gives them a debuff reducing their defense for a minute. Dispel becomes Triumph Feather, which is a buff that shoots angel feathers at enemies and does passive damage with your attacks every 4 seconds. Or 3 seconds? It's unclear going off this description. Holy Fountain becomes Fountain of Vengeance, which does its damage in its area in intervals which it does not specify. 60-second duration, 30-second cooldown. And lastly, Holy Water becomes Blood of the Divine, which increases your damage taken, pretty much destroys all your health recovery, and increases your final damage by 1% for every 2500 int you have, up to 15% at 37.5k int. The cooldown is normally 4 minutes and 20 seconds, but gets reduced by 12 seconds per 5000 int, down to a maximum of 140 seconds at 50k int. For hyper passives, ignore all the upgrades for Holy Magic Shell. Instead, remember when I talked about Holy Symbol getting a nice bonus at hypers? It's time. Boost everything for Holy Symbol. Flat 20% extra XP for yourself, extra status resistance for your whole party, and 30% extra drop rate for your whole party, including yourself. The halving effects of Holy Symbol once party members are outside of your range still applies to these too, but those are still majorly useful in bosses and the box rooms after a boss. Last things in hyper passives you'll want is the extra attack and boss damage for Advanced Blessing. Welcome to 5th Job! Here we have a hold down skill called Divine Punishment that builds up to 8 stacks, 1 every 8.5 seconds, that does a huge amount of damage in front of you. There's also Peacemaker, which hurls an angel forward that explodes once it reaches its maximum distance, or if you click the skill again. If you and or your party members are in the explosion, you all get a buff that increases damage for 8 seconds, as well as heals you and party members. I believe it only heals prior to the explosion if it passes through you and allies. It can only come into contact with 12 things. The explosion at the end also increases the damage further, depending on how many contacts are left on the skill. 1% extra damage each, 10-second cooldown. Benediction makes a big bubble that increases you and your party's final damage if they're within it. It also ups their attack speed and health and mana recovery. Not bishops. They don't get the attack speed either, sadly. If you cancel it early, it gives some of the cooldown back and reduces the duration. 3-minute cooldown, and to get the maximum use out of everything this skill has to offer, at its maximum level of 30, 112.5k int for 45% extra final damage, 20k int for 10% health and mana recovery, and 30k int for 3 attack speed level increases. Lastly, Angel of Balance replaces your Bahamut with 2 angels. One that heals party members and increases their damage, depending on skill level and total int, up to 100% damage at 125,000 int. The other angel does a ton of damage to enemies within range, debuffing them with another 60-second debuff that gives you and party members an extra 10% final damage for 1 hit before being consumed. 3-minute cooldown. Here's some other insanely useful 5th job mage skills bishops get. Mana Overload is a toggle that makes your spells cost more, but increases the final damage on almost everything that does damage. Ethereal Form is like a pseudo shadow partner for mages, letting you avoid damage and giving you super stance while in it. It doesn't work on one-shots though. 3-second duration, 1-minute cooldown. And lastly, the biggest and baddest of them all, Unreliable Memory. Despite its name, this skill is wildly reliable. When equipped, you get another skill called Mind Delve, which brings up a menu of other skills to choose. You can't use this skill without first selecting one of these, and one of these happens to be an insanely useful buff that increasingly increases your final damage. Yeah, Infinity is on this menu. This skill is pretty much used exclusively just for that. Always pick Infinity for Unreliable Memory. Now you have 2 Infinity casts, with the Unreliable Memory one having a slightly longer cooldown, varying on a number of factors which I'm not entirely sure of. The skill just says, according to set probability rates. Here's how you make Bishop easy. Have all your toggles, buffs, and summons on you, and out at all times. They're all useful, and most last longer than their cooldown anyways, minus Infinity. Unless you're bossing in a party, most of the time you'll have enough sustainability for yourself in solo play, so stick with having Righteously Indignant toggled on just about at all times. In a boss party though, make sure you have your fountain set up, and are tossing out holy waters whenever you can. Also keeping at the very least decent advanced blessing on your party members. Use Peacemaker just about any time it's off cooldown, because that's free damage for everybody. Keeping the Angelic Wrath debuff on a boss helps a lot too, alongside making sure you have the Triumph Feather buff and Fountain of Vengeance set up nearby the boss for an extra little bit of damage. Holy Magic Shell does help reduce damage, but does not prevent one-shots. Same with E-Form. It guards against most damage, but not everything. Remember to be doing most of your damage with Angel Ray to both apply the stacking final damage debuff, as well as heal your party. Also, again, I can't stress this enough. Don't resurrect people unless they ask you to. If they aren't ready for it, that just costs them a life for no real gain. For grinding, set up Fountain of Vengeance in a tactful spot that does good damage in its area. Also Urda Shower if you have an extra node slot for that. And just keep teleporting around the map with Big Bang. And occasionally casting Genesis and Heaven's Door for bigger damage with bigger hitboxes. Also Divine Punishment. Yeah, that's really it. Bishop gets a ton of XP and doesn't have to worry about grinding much beyond cast Big Bang. Touching back on Infinity, you can make it last way longer with the right setups for Legion and traits, boosting empathy, a buff duration inner ability, decent combat orders, increasing buff mastery ever so slightly. Around 163%, according to the Bishop Pocket Guide, is apparently the typical number you'd want to be aiming for. This doesn't mean Infinity gets 100% uptime, but close to it, being up most of the time. Though, if there's event buffs that increase buff duration, I believe you can achieve 100% uptime. The guide also has a whole chart outlining how much uptime you get depending on your buff duration. Segueing perfectly from that, for inner ability, you'll want to prioritize attack speed +1 and or buff duration. If you're low on honor, settling on a legendary buff duration line beforehand is fine enough too. The second and third lines you'd ideally want buff duration and boss damage, but some fine settles would be damage to abnormal status mobs, drop rate, meso, and flat magic attack or flat int. For link skills, the typical layout / rough estimation of these for grinding, making sure you get the most XP that you can with Aran, Evan, and Mercedes links, and damage from Lara's link, and these for bossing. You may be a support class, but having all of these helps tremendously because you still do a bunch of damage. For Trinodes, there's two you'll optimally want. Angel Ray, Heal, and Bahamut is the first Trinode, typically best for if you just wanted to focus on bossing, and Heaven's Door, Genesis, and Big Bang is the second, more geared towards grinding. Both are useful for both grinding and bossing, and each one boosts other skills. Heal boosts Angelic Wrath, Heaven's Door boosts Fountain of Vengeance, and Genesis boosts Triumph Feather. For weapon type, you have a choice between using a staff for extra magic attack, or a wand for 5% extra crit rate. The attack speed on both does not matter, because it's not tied to the speed at which you cast spells. It is always more worth it to choose staff over a wand, unless you just like how wands look. The 5% extra crit rate can easily be made up nowadays by various means, and you'll more than likely be close to, if not always, capped out on crit rate, with enough fairly decent links in Legion. Also, don't use a secondary, use a shield. More specifically, the best shield you can get is the Deimos Sage Shield. This shield can only be crafted through smithing, and its recipe drops from Cygnus. It goes up to 20 stars, and has the same potential tier as any other secondary above level 100. Very worth it. For burst / BA, place down all your summons, buff up with your non-cooldown buffs, pop one of your infinities beforehand if you wanted to optimize how much you get in 40 seconds, debuff the boss with Angelic Wrath, pop Angel of Balance and Benediction, use Blood of the Divine and Peacemaker. Start the BA here with holding down Divine Punishment and spamming Angel Ray for the remainder of the time. Shorten down further, place down summons, buff up, Infinity, Angel and Benediction, Peacemaker and Blood, hold Divine Punishment, spam Angel Ray. Bishop may have a lot of functionality in parties, but they're like a slightly more involved bowmaster when it comes to bursting. Just buff, place everything down, and spam your two main damaging attacks. Overall, surprisingly, Bishop doesn't play too differently nowadays versus how they used to play back then. More utility, no more spamming Genesis, but still a very strong support class that can now fend for themselves after their Destiny rework. As always, thanks for watching this guide. I hope it helped you make some sense of this silly little supportive magician. And shoutouts to the Bishop Discord, the Explorer Mage Discord, since there's not one dedicated to just Bishops as of the time recording this. They still have a ton of useful information about Bishop, and are pretty straightforward with how to make the best use of this class. Their pocket guide goes surprisingly in depth on the inner workings of certain things like Infinity Duration, and boss specifics for what is and isn't blocked with Holy Magic Shell and such. Making this class guide reminded me of how much fun I used to have with Bishop before getting distracted with other classes. It was even my first character in Reboot. I made this back in 2015. That's why I have the Apprentice Santa medal. I'm kinda glad I came back to them to make this guide, because now I'm remotivated to at least put some effort into them. Maybe push them up to 260 at some point to fiddle around with their 6th job. I've been asked by some friends close to me on which class guide to do next, so I have a good idea of what I'm doing next, but I really wanted to get Bishop out of the way first, since I was already working on this script. If there's other class guides you want to see me cover to the best of my ability, let me know down in the comments. That's all.